Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm excited to talk with the author of the December 2024 Aviatrix Book Club discussion book, Girls of Flight City. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Lorraine Heath, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk with you. I'm excited to close out the fourth year of the Aviatrix Book Club with this book as our discussion book. It was a perfect pick, I think, for this month. I will congratulate myself, but also congratulate you. For anybody who hasn't had a chance to read it, can you give us a summary of the book?
Sure. During World War II, the RAF sent its pilots to 6 schools in the southern United States, where they were trained. And the first school was set up in Terrell, Texas, which is about 30 to 45 minutes from Dallas. But women played a huge role in these schools. They were instructors. They ran the flight simulators. They were mechanics, parachute riggers. And so Girls of Flight City is inspired by the women who worked at these schools. And it follows the lives of 3 girls as they adjust to the British coming over here and their roles in helping prepare them to go back to war. So we have 3 characters. Jessie is a pilot, and so she is an instructor. Then we have Rhonda, who operates the flight simulator, which at that time they called a link trainer. And then we have Kitty, who is only 16 when the book opens. So she's still in high school and she works at the drugstore soda fountain. And the reason I wanted to have Kitty was to demonstrate how very young these cadets were, because she was age appropriate for dating them. And so that was her role in the book, to just really bring home that these were really kids just coming over here.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I cannot wait to hear how you came upon this story. But before that, can you just give us a brief summary of your writing career? Because a lot of the authors that I interview are people who are in aviation. And then sometimes I have the opportunity to interview an author like you who is widely published. Can you tell us a little bit about?
I always wanted to be a novelist, but in 1990, I decided to really pursue publishing a book. And I had only just discovered the romance genre, and I fell in love with it. And I knew that was the type of story I wanted to write. And so in 1993, I actually sold the first book. It came out in 94. So I've been publishing for 30 years now. And
Wow.
with the exception of Girls of Flight City, which is considered a historical fiction, all the other books I've written are historical romance. And some take place in Texas, some take place in England. In addition, I have written some books as for young adult audience. So it's just been a very busy career, but I love writing. I love coming up with stories, and so I've really enjoyed my role in writing.
It's an inspiring story. You inspire those of us who aspire to be writers like you. So thank you. And how lucky are we that you brought all of this writing background, and especially the romance, because while this book may not be categorized as a romance, there's definitely romance in it. How lucky are we that you brought that to a topic covering a very unique part of our aviation history and women's role in it? How did you come upon that story?
In 1991, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News about a, a woman named Virginia Brewer who lived in Terrell and tended to the British cemetery. And that was my first introduction to the fact that there was a British cemetery in Terrell. And it went on to explain how the British came over and were trained in Terrell. I believe she was like 68 at the time of the article. And so she had been tending to the cemetery for quite a while. But it just fascinated me that we had this bit of history. And I immediately envisioned a story. But I was just at the beginning of my career. I hadn't yet published anything. And so I just set it aside and focused on the romance stories that I wanted to write. But that story just always stayed with me. And so finally in 2019, I pitched the idea to my editor and she loved it. And so I went ahead and wrote it.
Oh my gosh. So tell me about the research.
So for the research, unfortunately, I was writing the story during the pandemic. There is a museum in Terrell dedicated to the British Flying School. I had planned the second week of March to go visit that museum in 2020, and that's when we went into lockdown, and so they weren't offering tours any longer. So most of my research, I had to use books. Tom Killebrew wrote 2 books about this part of our history. One is the RAF in Texas, and the other is the RAF over the skies of America. And so he went into a great deal of detail about how all of this came about, the challenges of doing it. So the British had approached us, I think like in 1940, but there was concern that if we helped them, Germany would declare war on us. And so it took a while for them to work it out. And for a while, it was done very covertly. As I mentioned in the books, the pilots weren't allowed to wear their uniforms except at the school. So it was just such an intriguing part of history that I just really found it fascinating. And I read, I can't remember the name now, but I also read a book about the school that was in Oklahoma. And did some research on the other schools just to try to get an idea of how they all operated.
Well, that's fascinating. And you were able to weave it into this gorgeous story, which feels so natural. And you have a lot of flying detail in there too. Like, how did you master that? Especially, I thought was interesting. You're telling the story of this woman, the main character, who is also, she's a flight instructor, and sort of the ups and downs that go with being an instructor, and having the responsibility on your shoulders of training pilots who are going to be out on their own. And sometimes bad things happen. And, you as the instructor are tied to that. And I loved the way that you wove that into the storyline. Kind of tell me about how you researched the pilot side of things for this, because you wrote it. To be honest with you, I couldn't tell that you weren't a pilot. So tell me about that.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I did purchase some introductory to flying books. Most of them were for children so that I could kind of get an idea of the aspects of the plane. But a friend of mine, Barbara Dunlop, who lives in the Yukon, her husband is a bush pilot. And he actually had flown a 1941 Stearman, which was one of the training planes used at the schools. And so whenever I would write a scene that involved flying, I would forward it to him. And he would come back and tell me all the things that I got wrong, and how I needed to correct them. So he was a great help.
Well, he did right by you. He was a great consultant. So thanks to him for his contributions to this fabulous story. So what do you have to say just about the development or the idea of the characters that you feature in the book? You talked a little bit about it at the beginning. And what I thought, I thought it was really sweet before we got on. I asked if you wanted to do a reading, and you mentioned that you always end up crying, which I think is wonderful, especially for an author to say about her own work. We could really tell that you put, your own emotion and your own heart into the story. So I'd love to hear, kind of how you decided on the characters and the storyline.
Uh, I also want to just mention that I felt a close connection to Terrell because my dad graduated from high school there in 1935.
Okay.
And
Oh,
my mom grew up outside of London during World War II. So the town she lived in was called Watford, and they had a munitions factory there. So they were very often bombed. So I grew up listening to her stories of what it was like growing up with a war going on. And she would talk about seeing all the planes going across the sky and as they were, going out to meet the enemy. And so for me, the story was just very personal because I had those two connections to it. And so when I began writing it, I wanted characters to display different aspects of what it was like in this small town because I not only wanted to show the school, I wanted to show what small town Texas was like during the war. And
yeah.
there were people who really welcomed the pilots. There were people who distrusted them. And so the three characters I have is Jesse, who is the pilot. And during this era, as I'm sure y'all probably know, flying was very popular among women. The problem was that women weren't seen seriously as being pilots, so they weren't able to get jobs in the airline industry that was just starting out or much of anything, but they were able to find employment as barnstormers, doing tricks and different things with planes and doing crop dusting, which was actually a very dangerous thing to do because they had to fly so low and they had to go beneath wires and things. So I knew Jessie could be very skilled because she was a barnstormer and she did crop dusting. And so I wanted her to be at a place where she was having to deal with the prejudices against women at that time. Then Rhonda was the flight simulator operator, and they were called link trainers. They were plywood boxes. They would put the pilot in, and the only thing he had was the controls. They'd close him up, and the operator would sit at a table, and she would control the box that the pilot was sitting in so that she could give him turbulence or cause a stall. She would give him a route that he was supposed to follow. And there was a little, they called it a crab, a little thing on her desk that actually marked the route that he took so that she could know if he was flying the way he needed to fly. Because a lot of these pilots would be flying at night. And so they really had to learn how to fly by instrument. And then, as I mentioned, Kitty, cadets would hang out at the drugstore, going in to get their sodas and their ice creams. And so Kitty worked there at the soda fountain. And so she had a chance to see them away from the school. And I was able to give people a view of them away from the school. And for the cadets, food was in abundance over here. We weren't yet rationing anything. And so it was very different from what they had come from. And I guess it was sort of a little vacation, even though they understood that, when they went back, they were going to be facing a lot of challenges. So I wanted these women to give a reflection of what life was like during that time and how their lives changed because of the men that they met and the men that they helped during this time.
Well, you did a wonderful job with all of that. So thank you so much. Obviously, you were intrigued by this story enough to dive into it and write a novel about it. What do you hope that readers take away? Obviously, you've also mentioned sort of what was a small town in Texas like pre-war? What were people feeling about the war? What do you hope people take away from this novel? What do you hope it accomplishes?
I hope it makes them aware of the history and the partnership that we had during the war with Britain, where we did train more than 6,000 of their pilots. And I would like for people to know that there is the cemetery in Terrel, and every November during the Memorial Day that is in England, it's usually the second Sunday, they hold a service at the cemetery, and RAF officers come to the ceremony. It's very nice. It's very emotional. And the other thing is that there is, as I mentioned, the museum in Terrell. And I was hoping that the story would make people aware of it so that they might go visit the museum. And staff at the museum has told me that they've had several visitors come who said they learned about it from reading Girls of White City. And so that made me feel good. Made me happy that people are aware or more aware of this history, because I really just found it so fascinating. It was just such a different time. And it's important that we remember that how we all worked together to defeat Germany and Japan and Italy.
I absolutely love that you latched onto this story. I didn't know anything about this, and I've been a kind of a dedicated student of our history for the past 4 years, at least. And so it was wonderful to see a new aspect. I say all the time about how I am able to enter into history through this portal of the shared experience of women aviation in ways that I wouldn't have really found the interest to do through other stories. And so people like you who find these little details and decide to expand them into a story that we can read now and kind of experience that history through your story. I'm so grateful to the work that you do to research it and to represent it, especially bringing all of your writing experience and talent to the story, to bring this history not just to my community, but to preserve it for for our country and for our world history as well. So thank you so much for everything that you have done to preserve this beautiful story and to do it in such a lovely way. I love the romance that is sort of the subplot of this story. I love the way, I won't spoil it, but I love the way that you tie it together. And it sounds like the ending was somewhat inspired by this article that you initially read, which I loved. So thank you for all of it. And there's a sweet Christmas scene, which is fun for us to enjoy in December as well.
I appreciate that you enjoyed the story and that you were interested in it and in the history that it revealed.
Oh yeah, I loved it. And I know we have our first book club discussion tonight, and then we'll have one on the last Sunday of this month. And I just so you know, our book club discussion on Sunday, the last Sunday of the month, is early in the day in the United States. It's 1 p.m. Eastern. And so we have several friends from across the pond who join us, including from the UK. So I know that I love to hit some RAFs and air transport auxiliary and those kinds of things in our books as well, because it's part of our history. And so this one is a really special one, and I know they're going to love it. So I can't wait to talk with them about it. Is there anything else that you want to say about this book before we talk maybe just for a few minutes about more in depth about writing?
I did want to mention that there is a subplot in the book that involves Jesse's brother,
Oh, yeah.
her brother Jack, and it's done through letters because since the book was taking place in Texas, I didn't want people to forget that it was because of what was happening in Britain. And so Jesse's brother is also a pilot, and he went over and joined the RAF. And that was a bit of fascinating history that I just happened to run across. The Americans who wanted to go over and fly for the RAF, it was actually against the law at the time for them to do that. And so they risked losing their citizenship, and they risked being imprisoned if they were caught trying to get over to England. And there was a fascinating book I read called Yanks in the RAF. It went through the process of several of the pilots who went over and what they accomplished while being there, the sacrifices they were willing to make. And I just found it fascinating that going to help somebody would not be seen as a good thing. And so I tried to incorporate that into the story as well, just to kind of give an overview, a wider view of everything that was going on during that time.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That is also a fascinating aspect of this story that, we are familiar with a little bit later when American women went over and supported the Air Transport Auxiliary, but I was not familiar with that particular aspect and the taboo against it. So thank you for also bringing that to light. That was fascinating. Yeah. So we have a lot of aspiring authors who also listen to these interviews. And so I was just going to ask you, you kind of talked about your career and that you always wanted to be a novelist, and then you kind of latched onto the romance thing. What advice do you have for anyone who is trying to build a career as a romance author?
For anyone who is actually writing, I think it's important when you're starting out to realize that your draft is your draft. It's not going to be what you envisioned for the story. It's going to be rough. And I think sometimes people look at their drafts and they get discouraged because it's not where they thought it should be. But writing is a process. And once you get your draft in place, then it makes it easier to go back and make it into the story that you wanted it to be. And so I just don't want people to get discouraged when they first start writing something. But for romance, so every romance is a love story, but not every love story is a romance. So a romance has to have a happy ending. And the focus needs to be on the couple, even though you can have other things happening in the story. So that's why in Girls of Flight City, they weren't all romances because some of them didn't have happy endings. But yes, if you're writing romance, you just need to be sure that you have your happy ending. Your focus is on the characters and their growth, their story arc, because that's what the romance readers are expecting.
Well, I appreciate that primer because romance is not the genre that I spend most of my time in. I love to dip in every now and then, especially with a story like this. So thank you for sharing that distinction with me as a reader and someone who is also writing stories that all involve relationships. So now I understand better what the expectations are that I'm setting up at the beginning of my novel. So I appreciate that. Well, is there anything else that you would like to share with us, Lorraine? I really appreciate your time, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to hear from you about this story and about writing. Do you have anything else you want to share?
I just want to thank you for having me, and for your interest in Girls in Flight City, and for asking me all these wonderful questions about it. As I mentioned, it was a very personal story in many ways. So see, I can't even talk about it without starting to cry. But anyway, I really appreciate you for having me here. Good luck with your story that you're writing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Lorraine.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for another awesome year of discussions. I appreciate everybody's participation. And to all of you who are listening out there, send me some feedback. Let me know that you're enjoying the content. Either comment on my social media, or you can send me an email at lizbooker@literaryaviatrix.com. I'd love to hear from you. We'll keep it going into next year. If you're looking for the Aviatrix Book Club reading list for 2025, you can find it on my website, or you can listen to me talk about it on my YouTube channel, both of which are Literary Aviatrix. Blue skies and happy reading.